And Zoom lets you know that, in fact, recording is happening. So say what you will, but you're here, posterity's sake, for all time on these recordings of the Orzarua Talmud class 5782. So shalom aleichem to learners here who are in the Zoom room and in the Beit Midrash, the Zoom Beit Midrash. And as we said, to those listening in, we hope that you'll join us on Wednesday nights live, but thanks for listening. In addition, we want to say that we're starting off on Zoom. It's in my mind to get together a certain number of times, at least in person, even if we have to wear masks. And if the world should open up and we're really unmasked and we can all get back to the sanctuary, to the sanctuary, yes, and the Beit Midrash, then we should find each other in the Orzarua Beit Midrash and learn together. So that's the plan as of now. And wow, it's really nice to see all these familiar faces back, and welcome again, Jonathan. So this year, I really wanted to learn a Masechta that was about criminal justice, about some of the rabbis thinking concerning the processes of justice, the machinery of justice, the gears of justice. I wanted to jump in and find a tractate that was in its size, potential to get through, not just like last year where we did one chapter of Avodah Zarah and chose even from the end of it and made a siyum, of course, on that which we studied and learned out with the commentators. But I wanted to have a potential Masechta that we're going to be able to get through 3 chapters, and it's going to kind of flow because the materials will flow in a way that potentially allows us to embrace the whole Gemara together. I learned it out anyhow, so that when we make a siyum, I'm really trying to learn everything that we start vis-a-vis the chapter or the Masechta. I'm putting it down now that it's not just one chapter that I want to get through. I'd like to get through in Makkot, and I'm going to turn to the end to tell you how many pages it is right now. I would like us to be able to get through the 24 pages of Makkot this year. Now, of course, that doesn't mean we're not going to stop and talk and learn and reflect as we have and do, and that you should bring your expertise and life experience to the text and all of that kind of, clarifying, questioning, and thoughts that stem from it. And we're going to get a little bit into the lines of inquiry like we do all the time with contemporary scholarship that might kind of be a line of inquiry that flows off the page, or we might stop and take a look at a conceptual analysis of one of the Gemara's either rhetorical frameworks or concept within the criminal justice system that's really brought to the fore by the rabbis on the daf, on the page of Talmud. All that said, we're going to press through some good text, and we're going to let it flow sometimes, because you get a feel for this Masechta particularly that they want to encourage a reading that doesn't stop so much with one little paragraph, but it might take 3-4 paragraphs in order to understand where they're coming from to try to make their point. So that sometimes is going to feel like being flooded with text, but then we're going to go back and just say why we needed to look at it 2 or 3 different ways. And that's even going to happen right from the start. But like with any good tractate of Talmud, we also need a little bit of background, especially this one, because it seems like they're in the middle of a major inyan, a major issue, a major concept, a major part of law. And we're going to really embrace learning a little bit of that by looking at Torah verses. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go back and just do an introductory little bit of learning with some straightforward text from Torah, and just mention what our issue is before we get even into that. And that is, you see that we are on Bavli Makkot, and take a look at the image on the cover of the Steinsaltz edition. So Makkot are lashes. And that is the item with which you can, if you are the court's punisher, you administer the lashes with this kind of an ancient lashing penalty instrument, or kli shel Makkot. And don't think for a minute that it isn't a contemporary issue. I just want to read for you the couple of spots where we see that Makkot are absolutely in the news. How now, you say? How now? Makkot have made the news. As of 2011, here's the article. I'm going to share the screen. In lieu of prison, bring back the lash. Suggest adding the whipping post to America's system of criminal justice, and most people recoil in horror. But offer a choice between 5 years in prison or 10 lashes, and almost everybody picks the lash. What does that say about prison? America has a prison problem. Never in the history of the world has a country locked up so many of its people. We have more prisons than China, and it has 1 billion more people than we do. 40 years ago, America had 338,000 people behind bars. Today, 2.3 million are incarcerated. We have more prisoners than soldiers. Something has gone terribly wrong. And the lash or the prison cell. Author of a new book, advocating flogging criminals instead of locking them up, admits he was trying to lob a hand grenade into the debate on how to reform our incarceration nation. Peter Moskos was a professor at John Jay College here, a former Baltimore police officer, was having dinner in New Orleans with friends. New Yorker writer Dan Baum and his wife, when the talk turned to current events, Baum mentioned that he had recently read that public schools in the Crescent City were paddling misbehaving students. Corporal punishment is illegal in New Orleans, as it is in most of the country, but according to Baum, parents at the school encouraged the practice. So what I want to suggest is that even though he wanted to just lob this hand grenade, that the wisdom of the Gemara, as we have affirmed and asserted all of the years we've been learning together, all the years that Kavoda Rav Wexler held court in the Beit Midrash of Or Zarua with Talmud, that we stay often in the purity of the text, and we get into the depths of the issues, because they do have something to say, not only about what the text says and what the rabbis conceived of, and if the rabbis instituted any of this penalty system at all, according to scholars, and if they did establish courts of law, how they actually made their cases, and if they instituted certain punishments that they discuss within Sanhedrin, especially in Makkot, especially capital punishment and lashes, corporal punishment. But we also see it in the context of a great discussion around the issues of our time with the criminal justice system that we see seeking the deepest and, let's say, at least fair justice under the law, equitable justice, at least equitable access, that we understand that there are issues of incarceration behind a lot of the discussions that are happening in the Gemara in Sanhedrin and Makkot, and I'm combining the two because our Gemara Makkot is actually considered a continuation of part of Sanhedrin, which is the tractate about the courts of Jewish law. And Makkot gets its own, and it kind of separated off. And so what I want to say already is that it's separated off, not only because it was just like too long or something like that. The rabbis wanted to end Sanhedrin, And then they wanted to start Makkot separately for corporal punishment, because corporal punishment to incarceration, to alternative sentencing, to rehabilitative versus retributive sentencing, to all the issues of justice and adjudication of criminal justice that we have today in our world, were for the rabbis part of the discussion, even when it feels like we're in very specific legal frameworks of very specific cases and very specific types of either defendants, or in our case, to open the Makkot tractate, witnesses. And right off the bat, when we're talking about conspiring witnesses, because that's where we're really going to start, the conspiracy between two witnesses is not only a devious scheme vis-a-vis those two witnesses, but it is a total corruption of the judicial system in and of itself, and it's the use of the judicial system, in essence, as a weapon. And so this is a discussion that, yes, points to the status of those individuals who are going to be called Eidim Zomamim. They are conspiring witnesses, and the Torah outlines what that looks like and what case might sound like. And we're going to look at that Torah text in just a minute. As I said, we're going to start with some Torah to bring us into the Talmud. And the rabbis are saying, stop for a moment, consider here, what's the status of this person? Is this person just an average everyday criminal who was a conspiring witness and planned with his friend, Reuven plans with Shimon to make false testimony? Are you just going to say they did a bad thing? Or are you going to call them in some way a sinner? Or are you going to call them a rasha, an evildoer? Like, what's the status you're going to assign to these individuals so that they not just become perpetrators, perps under the law and potentially prosecuted, but what do they represent? And what does that mean by way of our pursuit of justice in the big? And so that's some of what we're dealing with all the texts that we're going to be looking at. And like I said, we're going to start with Torah, created an introduction to the Masechta with a few psukim. And let me share those now. Here we go. You should be able to see my screen with Exodus 20:13 and Exodus 23:7. Meira, because I see only a couple of people when I actually share my screen. I don't see everybody yet. Can you just give me a thumbs up? You see those verses, Meira? Yes, good, thank you. Trying to get to that screen where I can pull everybody's window on my other computer so I can still see all of you. Okay, so now I see all of you. So Exodus 20:13, very, very interesting. This is all in one verse, even though they're called separate parts of the 10 Commandments. Lo tirtzach, you shall not murder. Lo tinaf, you shall not commit adultery. Lo tignov, you shall not steal. Lo taneh v'reacha ad eid shaker. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. It would seem like I have a commandment that is very straightforward, as straightforward as thou shalt not murder, when it comes to not bearing false witness against your neighbor. It's in the singular, mind you, lo taneh. So maybe this is a case where it's about one witness. And when I have two witnesses, I might need a different category, and I can expect the Torah to deal with having two witnesses that are conspiring to make up a story and try to either completely accuse someone of everything from murder to adultery to stealing or any other kind of penalty under the law. So that gives me one opening to say, if I want to have the category of Eidim Zomamim, meaning conspiring witnesses in the plural, I could potentially reject this notion that I'm dealing with conspiring witnesses if this commandment, lo taneh v'reacha, don't bear false witness against your neighbor, is being violated by one witness. And you might remember, and I know we all probably do, two witnesses within the judicial system of the rabbis. They must have exactly the same testimony in order to effect a gzar din. In other words, in order to effect having testimony that we accept as edus for especially capital crimes, or anything that has gotten a serious punishment as karet, exile, or other major status changes in someone's life, like there's certain marital relations that we're going to get into in the beginning of our Masechta and our tractate that impact a person's status as either a Kohen or ability to take on the Kohanic role or have the economic benefit of eating truma, the portion that's donated to a Kohen. So these are major questions that the court has to decide, and one witness is not enough. There are sometimes when one witness might be able to say something. I'm not going to get into this. This is not our issue right now. But I'm separating out from this verse in case somebody comes and says, when we start our learning in Gemara, well, wait a minute, don't we already have a commandment that says don't bear false witness? Because I'm going to explain to you this whole structure of what's called Eidim Zomamim. And Eidim Zomamim, it seems like they're bearing false witness, and it also seems like they're also transgressing Exodus 23:7. Midvar sheker tirchak. From a false charge, what? V'naki v'tzadik al ta'arog. Don't bring death on those who are innocent and in the right, for I will not acquit the wrongdoer. Lo atzdik rasha. So, in other words, if I see these verses and it says don't have false charges and don't bear false witness, why do I need this whole section in Deuteronomy? Well, it seems like you could say this might be a case where they want to play out those two laws, or it's going to now specifically give us another framework under the law that allows us to say that we will have someone come and maliciously give false testimony against him, and note bo sarah. So we say that there's like a different status here. And mens rea, which you may know is definitely pertinent to the legal status of laws about homicide and crime itself, one's mental state is mentioned here in Deuteronomy 19, and now has, in a sense, has an extra layer, even if it relates to those Exodus verses, the mindset of someone who's being criminal, someone who's maliciously falsifying testimony. The mindset now comes into play. And if Deuteronomy does nothing else, Deuteronomy has now added this dimension that someone who maliciously falsifies testimony against a friend, because it seems like it is it is in the singular at this point, that someone who maliciously does that will ultimately be treated in a different way, a little bit of a different way, and this will be the background text that we need to understand, again, the legal framework we're about to enter into in our tractate, which is Eidim Zomamim, or the construct of Hazama. Hazama. If a man appears against another to testify maliciously and gives false testimony, now we're in court, and I'm malicious, and I'm falsifying my testimony, the two parties to the dispute shall appear before the Lord, before the priests or magistrates in authority at the time. So just whatever the legal system was at the time. You know that we've talked about over history of the Jewish people, you didn't always have exactly the Sanhedrin. You had local courts, and Deuteronomy and Shoftim explains that there are judges for a certain time, and those judges have to be accepted as the judges, and gives a little bit of a chapbook about who the judges are and what they're supposed to be like. Anyway, the magistrates shall make a thorough investigation. V'darshu hashoftim heitev. That's both kind of after the fact and before the fact. We establish from this kind of verse the notion that any witnesses are really investigated as witnesses. You know, to the point where with a capital case, right, what's the verb used when it comes time to have a witness come and testify for a capital case? The verb in the Mishnah in chapter 4 of Sanhedrin is ma'ayamin oto. We threaten him. Are you sure you want to be this witness? You could have blood on your hands, and you could really be spilling blood among your brothers, and like that's the force of the language and the seriousness they take about giving testimony. Well, here they're going to go through a thorough investigation, and if the man who testified is a false witness, Eid Sheker, Ha'ed Sheker Anab V'achiv, he has testified falsely against his fellow. So what is this especially important for, to look at that verse? This will be like foreshadowing or saying it now and it'll come back later. If it says for his brother Achiv, it's saying his brother who's still alive. Just remember that. His brother who's still alive. In other words, he falsified his testimony. Let's say a second one gave the same testimony. The death sentence was the death sentence, but it was not actually fulfilled, the death sentence. It was between the Gezar Din and the Kiyum Hadin. It was between the decision and the sentencing and the actual administration of the penalty. So the fact that the Torah says that they found it out while his achiv, while his brother is alive, to add the idiomatic alive, that's what they learned from this, whether it says it exactly like that or not, right? Sometimes, we just have to go with background here, getting what the rabbis actually, say and use words for. So while his brother's alive, if they find that out, va'asitam lo ka'asher zamam la'asot la'achiv. Listen to this. They do to him as he schemed to do to his brother. And what's that going to allow us to do? Uvi'arta hara mikir becha. So what he schemed to do comes back right on him. Now, the rabbis who create a system that you need two witnesses for a capital case, in general, say about Eidim Zomimim and Sanhedrin, that if they are found to be scheming witnesses after a true investigation, they're conspiring witnesses. What happens is, what they scheme to do to their brother, the brother remaining alive, they find this out before the Kiyum Ha'onish. They find this out before the penalty is actually administered. They now receive the punishment that they schemed about dishing out to their brother. So they schemed to get him stoned, right? There are 4 different ways that the capital punishment is administered in the ancient world. And we have to just remember that in the general framework of Eidim Zomimim, we're talking about ad kedei kach, the cases with murder. And, you have stoning, and you have hereg with the sword, and you have chenek with the hanging, and you have the four is sreifa, the 4th one is with fire. So you have 4 mitot shel habeitin. You have arba mitot shel habeitin. You have 4 ways the beitin can punish. And if they conspired against him to say he did some crime that deserves stoning, well, because he was scheming against him to have him stoned, now the Eidim Zomimim are going to be stoned. And what's really interesting about Eidim Zomimim and Hazama, that in general, if someone's convicted of a crime and they are to be convicted and punished in a certain way because that crime goes along with a certain death penalty, the Eidim Zomimim, let's say they lost the sword and they can't do hereg, and that's what he was sentenced for. The Eidim Zomimim, you could actually administer capital punishment any way of the 4 that you have available to you. Within the Eidim Zomimim framework, within Hazama, finding certain witnesses to be conspiring witnesses, I have more leeway to actually administer punishments. And why do I have that? Because uviarta hara mikir becha. You have to get rid of this evil. What is the ultimate evil? that they totally bastardized the judicial system. They jeopardized the actual foundations of the system of justice that we expect to work. Now, that could be the whole explanation of Eidim Zomamim. We could say it's just with capital punishment. But the rabbis start to say, well, wait a minute. There's got to be certain cases that are going to make this system not so easy. You know, there's always exceptions to the rules. There's different ways of thinking about how and whether or not certain Eidim Zomamim could get the actual punishments that they schemed about dishing on their brothers, on their sisters. We have to really figure this out, because this hazama doesn't work out so easily every time. And that's going to be part and parcel of the discussions at the beginning of our Masechta. One more note before we move on. I'm going to share my screen again. So evil was this Eidim Zomamim issue. You see, I'm still sharing the screen, right? Sanhedrin 89 now. Tanu Rabbanan, Arba Atzrichim Hachrazas Hamasit Uven Sorer Umore Uzaken Mamre Be'edim Zomamim Bekulhu Kativ Bahu Bechol Am Bechol Yisrael Be'edim Zomamim Kativ B'Hanisharim Delokule Al Machazu L'Sahaduta. There are 4 transgressors condemned to be executed whose verdicts require a proclamation to inform the public. So not only that you've really administered this penalty against the conspiring witnesses, but there are 4 different verdicts that require a proclamation, one who instigates others to engage in idol worship. That was already last year. As a little bit of a review for those who learned Avodah Zarah, chapter 1, you could feel like that you're learning now really means something, because you know how sometimes you say, what did I learn it for? Well, at the very least, you learned it to be able to relate to this beginning of this passage in Sanhedrin. If you created the space or the field of play for idol worship, and remember how many different ways we could have done that. That's just not like saying, hey, here, go worship this idol. You were involved in the marketplaces that were near the old basilicas, that were near the old archaeological structures. You were involved on the wrong day before one of their festivals. You were part of the whole society. Remember, it's got to be decreed that you were found guilty, and the whole Am Yisrael, all the people need to be aware of that. What else do they need to be aware of? Stubborn and rebellious son, Ben Sorer Amore. Now remember, we also learned that one year. And the interesting thing about Ben Sorer Amore says explicitly in the Gemara, so it's not just modern scholarship that calls into question whether or not some of these frameworks really ever happened. Because remember, we saw in rabbinic era text itself, Lo haya v'lo yihye. Never really happened and never will happen. Why? Because if you recall, he had to be drinking the very special Chianti, the Italian wine. He had to have a certain kind of basar. He had to have a certain kind of meat. His parents had to speak almost with the same tone of voice. It had to be a mother and a father. They were like a chorus, almost like the Greek plays. They had to be singing out the warnings. They had to have, he could only be 13, but only for this many days before his bar mitzvah or right after his bar mitzvah. They made procedural default. That's the term we're going to use. Procedural default, part and parcel of their creating a system of justice. How many times does procedural default in the ancient world stop us from administering a death penalty? Well, the rabbis, we will get into this later, because in our Gemara, Makkot, one of the most famous sugyas about the death penalty will come up, and I'll wait to reveal when we get there. A little bit of, foreshadowing this way too. Tempting. But the rabbis kind of legislated it all out of play. And yet they say that conspiring witnesses need to be publicly proclaimed, that we found conspiring witnesses, so that people will ultimately know, and evil will be rid in the land. They want to create the potential for a system of justice that doesn't sound like you can really defraud anyone or bastardize the system of justice. And so it was that we had that notion. Now, the Sifrei in Devarim is one of the earliest halachic and midrashic texts that we have on Deuteronomy. And so just before we go into our Talmud, here we have a little bit of a story unfolding that sounds a little different than Torah and a little bit more administrative, as if they were defining a system for the whole notion of Eidim Zomamim and finding and proving that two witnesses are necessary in courts of law. Because again, this whole notion that testimony sounds like with the single verb in Exodus, that one person's testimony could really mean so much. We're going to take it on the face value based on the sources that we've started to look at and more that we'll hear in the Gemara, that two witnesses are being discussed. Eidim Zomamim, two witnesses' testimonies needed to really establish anything. Trey v'trey, as it says in our sources, two and two witnesses will come, and by the Eidim Zomamim, two more witnesses will come, and they will prove that the first witness's testimony is completely untrustworthy, not accepted, and wrong. That's the hazama that now we're going to enter the world of. The Eidim Zomamim, the conspiring witnesses, are proven to be so because two other witnesses will come and prove in the court of law, in the Beit Din, that these first two witnesses' testimony could not be true. Sifrei Devarim explains like this on our passage from Deuteronomy, which sounded like just the two parties were involved and the judges had to really discern. Listen to how it unfolds. Then the two men shall stand. It is a mitzvah for the litigants to stand. We have some courtroom procedure here. The two men, this tells me only of men as being required to stand. Whence do I derive the same for a man contending with a woman with a man, two women with each other? From who have the contention in any event? If so, why is it written men? Because it is written by the word of two witnesses. Now I've gotten back to the plural of two witnesses from a conversation that established that men and women had jurisdiction and could be dragged into the Beit Din. So yes, this includes discussions of women, despite the fact that we don't really get Eidot Zomamot or anything of that nature. We're going to say and hold out for a minute, where are the women within the picture of this Masechta, just so I can bring it into the first round too. We're going to ask that question down the line, but it's not going to be immediate. And here we are in the Sifrei saying there are two witnesses. I might think that a woman too may testify. But wait a minute, I have to refine a little bit about the women. It is therefore written here two and there two, just as two here are men and not women, so too there who have the contention. Now, this is a classic place and one of the places where we do get the sense that it's two men we might be talking about for the purpose of any edut that is provided within the court, within the Beit Din. And thusly, over thousands of years, women were really not considered for the purposes of certain rituals and the purposes of certain areas of testimony, kasher la'edut. They were not considered kasher la'edut. That is something that we will contend with in any part of Jewish ritual law, even to this day, because it's said to men. The nice part of that, if you read against the grain a little bit, is that when it comes to ve'arta et hara me'amecha, when it comes to expelling the evil from amidst your people, the women can take a nice breath, a little, take it easy, because who's it talking about? It's talking about the men. It's talking about the men who you have to deal with. These, contentious people, these conspiring people. It's all the men. Anyhow, they think they're standing before flesh and blood. No, they're standing before the Lord. this kind of points towards the notion here, and this is a background piece again for our learning Gemara about the witnesses and their trustworthiness and their honesty. Why should we believe a second pair of witnesses that the first pair is completely wrong? Well, the rabbis take testimony and give a certain kind of trust. They put trust in people who are coming to be witnesses, benefit of the doubt. They know that the first pair could have been conspiring, but the second pair that's going to come along, it's a chiddush. It's one of those now kind of institutions that's founded in Jewish law, that the second pair of witnesses who come are going to be trusted, even though I know that there's a certain amount of worry I have for the corruption of testimony in my court of law. And why do they ultimately have a certain amount of trust in the witnesses who come to courts of law? Because they trust that people understand that they're before the Lord, before God, and that they know that punishment would be waiting for them in the next world if they really did anything wrong in this one and were even able to pull the wool over the eyes, even if they're willing to, even if they could conspire, even if they could trick and upend the entire judicial system, you know that that second pair of witnesses is not going to engage in that. And so we accept the testimony of a second pair of witnesses with Eidim Zomamim, because there's a sense that you're really coming before God. We are truly getting to the facts in this matter. We're truly identifying what is the Eidut Kshera, the honest testimony that needs to be brought to the case that's in front of the judges when they are allowing these contentious individuals to stand up kind of against each other. So what happens? Just going to get to the place. The judges inquire. They're subject to 7 inquiries. When it's derived that there are also bidikot, examinations and factual reviews, we derive that because we want the true and correct testimony. Behold, a false witness is the witness. Now, here's where we get this verse that we just learned above. Whence is it derived that through his testimony he brands his neighbor a false witness? False. Has he testified against his brother? I might think that even if their testimony has been cross-examined and accepted in the Beit Din, and other witnesses come to refute the refuters, that the latter are rendered Eidim Zomamim. It is therefore written, and the judges inquire well, and behold, the first refuters are detained, only so long as Beit Din needs them, and not after their testimony has been cross-examined in Beit Din. A witness, 2 of them, come, and then you shall do to him as he schemed to do to his brother, because those 2 witnesses testify that there's no way they could have ever been right, the first 2 witnesses. Those 2 come, they determine it, and we don't let the whole cycle of a next pair of witnesses and a next pair of witnesses continue along, because it might seem logical to you that if one pair of witnesses testifies and then a second pair comes and says they're wrong, that the first pair of witnesses just get another pair of witnesses and refute the refuters. But what this text is ultimately informing us about, and what Masechet Sanhedrin ultimately said, was that because they know they're before the Lord, and because the party or 2 witnesses are going to come against the first 2 witnesses and testify, those 2 that zamam la'asot, those 2 that schemed against the original defendant, they will be found to be Eidim Zomamim. The court will believe that second pair of witnesses because they are the trusted souls who rise up against the first 2 witnesses to say, no, they were schemers. They sought the penalty of stoning. They sought to call him a murderer. And that is what happens is what they scheme to do is done to them. As we said, if it's lashes or stripes, if other punishments. And of course, this brings in the notion of Exodus back to the 10 Commandments. You shall not testify against your neighbor false testimony to do to his brother. And from here they ruled, Eidim Zomamim are not killed unless the verdict has been pronounced to kill the defendant. If the verdict's announced to kill the defendant, they're killed. In summary, to understand the beginning of our Gemara is to understand that there has been established Eidim Zomamim, an institution where two witnesses falsely conspire against a person, even in a capital case, have him committed, have him sentenced to death, and then two other witnesses come and say, these two are Eidim Zomamim. It couldn't have happened. And what did they ultimately have to testify? Because those guys were with us. And it couldn't have happened the way they said it. They don't give a whole new set of facts. They don't tell how the case really happened. They just say about the witnesses, they are not kosher because they were with us and it could never have been that way. We trust them because they are before the Lord. And what they scheme to do to their brother is done to them. That's Hazamah. And we'll get a wacky little exception in that very schematic reality about such a clear-cut case even in our Masechta. But our tractate now is going to begin in a different way with a different issue, and that is, but wait a minute, does it work out so cleanly every time? Because can the punishment that someone schemes against his brother actually be administered to everyone and anyone? Are there certain punishments that cannot be administered even if someone, two witnesses, schemed against their fellow Jew and there's going to be a pronouncement of sentence X, Y, or Z? If it can't be that I, the conspiring witness, can become or have done to me punishment X, Y, or Z, how is this institution of Eidim Zomamim really going to work? That's where we begin. And that's where we'll start in a second with a share of the screen. But in case anybody needs a clarifying question or has a comment already, we've looked at a little text now. Familiar institution to you? Need to clarify something? What's it bring to mind already? Tell me what you're thinking. Ron, go ahead.
I want to add two terminologies, psak din and gzar din. Psak din is where when the judge declared the punishment, and gzar din is the execution of it. So what happened when the judge investigate the witness or the two witnesses and find out that they are Eidim Zomamim, not between the psak din and gzar din, but through the court system, through the process of the court hearing?
Well, here's the thing. In order to be be called Eidim Zomamim, there has to be a very specific procedure followed. Two other witnesses must come and testify in order to make the two witnesses into Eidim Zomamim. There's no such thing as finding the witnesses as Eidim Zomamim by the judge. What can happen is that at a Beit Din, a judge can find that certain Eidim don't stand up to the test of being kasher la'edu. So there's a whole way in Sanhedrin that we have about making sure that a witness himself can be kosher as a witness. Remember, there's a famous way of saying someone is or isn't kasher la'edut. I'm going to put it in the chat. So what we hold you accountable to is, if you're a Mesachet Kubiyot, if you play dice, if you roll the dice, if you like Atlantic City or you go to Vegas, sorry, you don't qualify to be a kosher witness. There are other ways that someone is not kasher le'edut, and that will just lead to a dismissal. Even if I have a case where two witnesses come to try to testify in a different way, and this is part of the problem, and this is going to bring us into a lot of different Gemaras that will make your head spin if we went this direction. If I said we have two witnesses, and then I have two witnesses who come and don't use the Eidim Zomamim framework, but they try to say something else happened, or they want to testify for a different thing like this or a different thing like that, and they don't use the Zomamim challenge, then what's going to really happen is it's Trey versus Trey. It's 2 versus 2, and it's going to lead to a dismissal in that court. And so one of the reasons why I actually have Eidim Zomamim as an institution is to answer the challenge of finding a way to hold conspiratorial witnesses accountable and to actually have them punished for it, as opposed to everybody's just dismissed from the court because we're not getting into any reliable testimony over here because I have such high standards. You use the terms, by the way, just, Pesach-din and Gezar-din. I use the term, I think, Gezar-din and Kiyum Hadin. And really it's Kiyum HaOnesh, I had changed it to. And so those are some of the different ways that we express it. It's true, Ron could say it was first a psak, it was first decided, and then Gezar, it was decreed and done. I use Kiyum because more rabbinically, they want to know more that it was absolutely done. And Kiyum is a word in rabbinic literature that I use that speaks to absolutely it was done, because there's a difference for Eidim Zomamim. If, by the way, and this is the kind of thing we're going to get down the line a little bit, what happens if the execution already happened versus it's just the time between the sentence and the guy awaiting his execution? So that discussion is going to unfold down the line in our Gemara.
Do we have any data on the frequency with which these events occurred?
Well, all right. So one of the books we're going to also be looking at in the course of study this year is this wonderful and fantastic book by Devorah Steinmetz, Dr. Devorah Steinmetz, teacher currently in Boston at Hebrew College, among the other various places she teaches now that the world can, learn on Zoom in addition to in person. And she wrote a book on the rabbinic construction of criminal law. And one of the highlights already from the beginning, Barry, since you asked now, I'll read it now. I was just going to read it at the end, but she'll already say, and this is, again, to say that it's the scholars wondering aloud, do we have data? Do we know? Do we know this was administered at all? Do we know that this particular institution of law ever really happened the way that we're about to learn it, or learn the end of it in the first chapter of Makkot? Because as I said, the beginning of this whole discussion that I've just basically summarized goes on in Sanhedrin. And so there's some questions about the rabbi's insistence that any of this really did unfold. And the nature of our Talmudic discussion is something along the lines of, if we had power in our own courts, to when we had power, we thought that this could be a good system, but we never really could institute it because administratively and with procedural default, we always found ourselves questioning our system that we instituted. And thankfully, we really never had such a need for this reality. And she'll bring up like Moshe Halbertal, who says that the goal of rabbinic revision of capital law and some criminal law, like the rebellious son and maybe even Edim Zomamin, was to minimize damage to the body of the executed criminal or individuals who were found guilty, because no one would really be willing to come up and try to make Edim Zomamim into Edim Zomamim. And most of the cases were trey v trey, 2 witnesses versus 2 witnesses, and one pair brought into doubt what the other one was saying, and they would all be dismissed, or there was such a level of need for warning before a murder, like hatra'ah is such a big thing. And how does a person really understand what the crime is, what the penalty is, what will happen in the court of law? The entire thing had to be understood before someone could actually be sentenced to death, right? The warning had to be so deep and detailed that we would only administer capital punishment if they got warned in such a degree, with such depth. And so, lo haya v'lo yiyeh, never was, never will be. Another thing, Lorberbaum, a scholar, says that the whole system is a system that tries to bring out the most ethical, foundational responses we could have to the Torah's ultimate commandments. And that we see that iconic notion of Talmudic debate is that we always have a debate about whether or not we are able to do anything except say, God will administer the ultimate punishment by the hand of heaven. And so there's already this question about this being a project, a philosophical type of project, not philosophy in the classical sense of question and Socratic method, but somewhat of a poetic and literary and legalistic foray into what's possible. And so, no, the answer squarely is we don't have data. There's no tables. No one's ever put that together. We've not had any court stenography discovered per se, except, remember the last round, we did find parallel texts to the Gemara about the king and the high priest appearing in the local court during the Maccabean rebellion. One theory is that some of this was written and conceived of during the Maccabean rebellion, when we did have a little bit of our own hegemonic kind of place in the world. But there's a very important concept vis-a-vis the Sanhedrin and even the Beit Din of 23, and that is Misherabu Rotzchin Nistayem Beit Hadin. Since there was so much proliferation of violence and murder in Israel, right? You might think I'm about to say the court system revved up, but I'm about to tell you this, the saying in rabbinic texts is, since there was such violence and murder, our Beit Din stopped functioning. Why is that? Because we couldn't conceive of doing this to ourselves. And maybe that other authorities were really the authorities that had to be kind of there as they had created the state. They were statecraft. They were really the hegemonic power. And we kind of left some of that where we would be the ones to either do the capital or corporal punishment to their hands. These are all conceptions, okay? And some of what we're about to read really sounds like we have it pretty square, and that we do have systems of justice to think about and administer. And it sounds like, okay, we've figured out a way to actually fish out or what do you call it? Kind of, really have a process of discovery when it comes to identifying conspiratorial witnesses. And so let's get into the Gemara and keep asking that question. Does this sound like it could have been a system that could have been at work? And remember that we were already expected to understand that Sanhedrin started the conversation, and we're going to pick up midway. All right, we good? Weiter?
Is this just false testimony or is it conspiratorial testimony?
It's conspiratorial, and it was said so in chapter 19 of Deuteronomy, that it was indeed zamam. So that verb that I keep emphasizing with edim, zomamim, or hazama as the concept, really implies a mens rea, a malignancy, scheming, and that is at the heart, potentially, of why the discussion goes so deeply about how we punish these people, why we get to punish them, if we really did, or if we would, and goes to the heart of the matter, more than just eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth kind of justice. We're talking about a deeper issue because they purposefully schemed against not only the individual they are going to have sentenced, but they've really uprooted the trustworthiness within the law and within the judicial system that has to be part and parcel of any judicial system that really functions properly within society. So thanks for emphasizing that with the question. Okay. Let me get now the Gemara up. Where is it? Hold on. Here we go. Daf Bet Amud A. Right there, here we go. Continuing in for our learning this year. We're in Masechet Makkot. Great to start it with you. And we're in the first Mishnah of the Masechta. Heitzad ha'edim na'asim zomim. The question seems to be pretty straightforward. How are witnesses rendered conspiring witnesses? Now, I just told you all of how they're rendered to be conspiring witnesses. And why did I tell you that? Because the Mishnah seems not to hang and answer that question. The Mishnah immediately goes to what might be considered the first exception to the rule that we have. If the natural course was to find Eidim Zomamim responsible for what they schemed against someone, and they scheme against this guy, and they tried to take away his rights as a Kohen, well, if they're not Kohanim, can I take away their rights as Kohanim? Oy vey. You know, I'm left with, what do I do? What do I do? So the Mishnah is going to bring up that case. The Gemara later is going to tell us, like, why didn't they answer the first question first? But we're going to be here. Me'idin anu ba'ish ploni shehu ben grusha or o ben chalutza. Ein aimrim ye'aseh ze ben grusha o ben chalutza tachtav. Ela lokei arba'im. We testify about that guy. Remember that ish ploni is the way we say, what's the name in English that we usually use? John Doe.
John Doe.
Yeah, thank you, Doe. So we say about John Doe, who is a priest, Shehu ben Grusha or ben Chalutza. He's the son of a divorced woman or the son of a Yavama who performed the rite of Chalitza. That's that special kind of ceremony that someone does if she has to marry the brother of her husband who died, and she then was able to marry. But a Kohen cannot marry a divorcee or a Yavama. And thusly, this guy renders himself what's called a halal. So what does that mean, a halal? He was the son of a Kohen. The transference of Kohenic status comes from the father. And yet, when he is the son of a divorcee or the son of a Yavama, he himself is a halal, meaning empty, meaning that he is not eligible, doesn't qualify for the Kohenic status. That would mean that he can't be in the priesthood in the way that a regular Kohen could be. Would also mean he can't eat truma, because that special gift that the Kohanim are granted, the support they're granted from Am Yisrael, is now not available to him. He can't eat it. And so his status is a halal. Now, what do we say? If those witnesses, the case here is that we see that witnesses said this. Those witnesses are not Kohanim. Or even, let me now even put a different twist. What if they even are? Do we actually punish them with the same sentence that they schemed about when it came to the Ish Ploni, who they testified against? The reason why our Masechet is called Makkot is because it deals with the punishment of lashes. The Torah actually uses the language of Makkot versus Lokeh or Malkot with a kuf. The Torah uses it with a kaf. But here you see that he gets 40 lashes as punishment for false testimony if it's found out, because they are made into Eidim Zomamim. Two other witnesses came and said, no way could they know that, because they were with us, and they don't get a status change as being non-Kohanim who can't eat truma and can't do avoda. They get lashed 40 times. Now already, if you're asking, wait a minute, you reminded me that they came and testified they were with us. How does that prove anything? How does that prove anything? If they testified that I knew his mother before and she was married, or I saw the Yavama actually do chalitza, wouldn't that kind of be exactly what we expected to hear? But the case is really about what happened with this guy who was a witness, or these guys who were witnesses, according to Rashi. Shehu ben Grusha, bifanenu nitgarsha imo. Oh, no, it wasn't about what those guys, where they were. There's a little twist, Rashi says. You thought from Sanhedrin that they had to say that it was the two guys who were with us. No, Rashi now twists it and says, we were there when bifanenu nitgarsha imo kodem shenolad v'harehu halal ufasul. They were saying that we were, sorry, let me go back. The guys themselves were saying that he's the son of a divorcee. And what they were claiming as the witnesses to disqualify the Kohen was that we were there when she was divorced on such and such a day. But the witnesses that come after that, who ultimately make them Eidim Zomamim, Rashi tells you that by saying, no, they were with us, it relates to the lie that they told about the day that they claimed to be in her presence when she got divorced. So now we understand what the facts of the case are from Rashi. So they were with us means they were with us, but on the day that they claimed that they were right there in the presence of that guy's mother who divorced her first husband or what's her second husband when she got divorced. No, that couldn't be. So they were made into Eidim Zomamim because it couldn't have possibly happened that way. The Mishnah continues. We don't make them themselves into a changed status of Ben Grusha or Ben Chalutza. We don't change those first two witnesses' status like we thought we should administer the punishment that they schemed to have thrust on this Ben Ploni. Ela lokei arba'im. Rather, there are 40 lashes. Now, the Torah will say about certain matters that you can administer lashes as a punishment and up to 40. And so what's important to remember is that we kind of don't have the verse in this Mishnah that proves from where we actually see that lashes are possible. But when we look back into Torah and we want to know that it comes from Torah itself, that we do have in mind that the Torah did allow for this corporal punishment. And so we're now okay, at least with the concept of corporal punishment, because Torah had said so. But the question still remains, and it'll be an open question as of right now. How do we get from the fact that this was the case and that we might have thought that they had some status change themselves, especially if they were Kohanim, but let's say they're not Kohanim and they can never have such a status change. Being a Ben Grusha or being a Ben Yavama wouldn't affect any change at all on these two Eidim that are considered now Eidim Zomamim, conspiring witnesses. How do we get from not giving them that punishment to using 40 lashes to punish them for this crime? So we're going to hold that question. We're going to hold that kind of thinking. How does corporal punishment really come to answer anything? Can we start to see a rabbinic conception, at least, of what amount of lashes or what lashes really come to answer? Well, right from the start, if I'd say that conspiring witnesses could either get the same punishment that they hoped that they schemed against someone with, or they can get 40 lashes. 40 lashes, by the way, a lot of lashes, seems very serious. And so they're assigning a very serious breach of criminal justice system to someone who comes and changes the rules for a Kohen, who disqualifies a Kohen. Now, it's beyond libel. It's economic loss because of truma, and it's fully out affecting and impacting generations to come. Maybe that's why I get the full 40, because couldn't it have been 5? You know, we read the newspaper article. People would take 5 and not prison. I don't know what they would say if it was 40. You know, can a person handle 40? These are big questions that are going to not be answered right away, but we'll try to address some of it as we go, because we want to see what the rest of the Mishnah says. What else does the Mishnah leave us with before we talk a little bit about what the Mishnah is doing? Hold on, we have to share in the right way. Okay, me'idin anu ba'ish ploni shehu chayav liglot. So the second case, or the third case, if you want to say, because the first one was about a divorcee and a situation of yibum. But anyway, the next part of the Mishnah, me'idin anu ba'ish ploni shehu chayav liglot. We say in a case where 2 witnesses came before the court and said, we testify with regard to so-and-so, John Doe here, that he's liable to be exiled to a city of refuge. Now, if you remember the Torah system for manslaughter, unwittingly killing another person, was to send somebody to one of the Are Miklat, one of the refuge cities. And that there he would have to stay until the death of the high priest. And there was a whole discussion about what that really means, and there will be more discussion of that. But he committed manslaughter, say the first two witnesses. Well, what happens when I have two witnesses who come and say, no, they were with us, couldn't have been, they're accepted. These two witnesses are found to be Eidim Zomamim. That's the assumption of the Mishnah. There is Hazama. There is Eidim Zomamim going on. There's conspiracy. Ein Omrim Yigle Ze Tachtav. We don't say, in that case, that an individual is exiled himself. The two witnesses that testify, we don't say that they were, just like the manslaughterer, to be exiled to the cities of refuge. What do we do instead? Ela Loke Arba'im. Rather, they receive 40 lashes. I can't make someone a disqualified Kohen if they're not Kohanim to begin with, and even if they were Kohanim, the Mishnah comes along and says 40 lashes and not any kind of disqualifying reality of your status as a Kohen. I need 40 lashes for those people, and I need 40 lashes for someone who wrongly accuses someone of manslaughter instead of actually sending them to a city of exile. Now, just a note on this last piece about the city of exile. If I bring it back to that article that was to be that kind of grenade into the discussion of criminal justice that I shared with you after that dinner in New Orleans, by that ex-cop from Baltimore and the professor at John Jay School of Criminal Justice, I might say that I could see already some formulation of lashes versus the rabbinic way of incarcerating a manslaughterer, right? If we liken being exiled to a city of refuge as the rabbinic way of incarceration, because, by the way, talking about the rabbinic system, incarceration is an interesting question as to whether or not there was really ever any kind of official prison and incarceration as we understand incarceration in our time today. It's a little different, as a matter of fact, and we'll get into a little bit of that. But if we are to say that this Mishnah in and of itself could lead us down that path of discussing some kind of corporal punishment versus some kind of incarceration or some kind of restriction of one's freedom within a certain boundary even, then that's an interesting discussion. That's an interesting discussion, and it may be that we outright reject corporal punishment, and you may outright reject corporal punishment, and there's nothing to talk about. But this was something that was, again, in a couple spots, and there's a book about it by a professor at a well-respected college of criminal justice. And so too the spiritual status of this Kohanim, so I don't want to try to make a parallel degradation of a certain spiritual status of a Yisrael. Like, let's say they were Yisrael, to go back to the first case. Like, couldn't I say that they're not Zoche Aliyot LaTorah? Jay, you can't call them for Aliyot. I'm sorry, you can't invite them. And we have to keep a list and know, like, who's on that list. They can still come to the shul to try to seek atonement, but maybe they're not, status-wise, they're not even Yisrael. Maybe they're halal in a different way. Maybe they're emptied of the right to be at the Torah. So, Lokin, though, we get Makkot instead. We get the strips. We get the stripes. We get lashes. So, thoughts, questions, clarifications? All right, I'm going into some Gemara then. We should say we made it into the Talmud and not just through a Mishnah on the first night of class. Barry, did you have something before I got there?
No. I'm cool. Let's
All right, good.
let's go on.
All right, so the Gemara is going to say, "Ha, keitzarin ha'edin nasin zaynamin mi ba'ilei." Wait a minute. Given the fact that the Mishnah presented these certain cases, shouldn't we have asked, how do they not become Eidim Zomamim? The addition of the word ain. The cases you presented me took these guys out of the framework of Hazama. These guys are now not Eidim Zomamim, because Eidim Zomamim that I know that you talked to me about earlier on in Sanhedrin, they got the exact same punishment that they schemed to effectuate against the person they testified about. So shouldn't the Mishnah have reframed the question? How are these Eidim not like the Eidim Zomamim Klasim? You know, how are they not like the classic Eidim Zomamim that I know? V'od. And furthermore, Midikatani Lakaman, from that, the Tana teaches in a Mishnah cited later on, and that's going to be on page 5. Aval amru lahem he'ach atem me'idin harei ba'oto hayom atem hayitem imanu b'makom ploni. How is it that if the second set of witnesses rendering the first two as conspiring witnesses said to them, how can you possibly know anything about that incident when on that day you were with us in such and such a place? These first witnesses are conspiring witnesses. Hare elu zomamin miklal de elu ein zomamin. One learns by an inference here from the final phrase in the cited passage that these are conspiring witnesses, that those enumerated in the Mishnah here, right, are not conspiring witnesses. In other words, if they're going to use the classic formulation that they were with us, and by the way, Rashi went with that. Rashi said, you were with us. You couldn't have been there when she got divorced and seen her get divorced. That's Zomamim. So let me add, fuel to the fire on the fact that you're asking really how do they not get tagged as Zomamim in the classic sense? How do we see these in some ways as different from the Eidim Zomamim that you have described both back in Sanhedrin, and now the Gemara says also in a little bit of Gemara that's going to come? Well, the Gemara is going to now try to answer both those questions. Tana Hatam Kaye. The Tana is kind of there. Kol azomim makdimin laotad mita chutz mizomim vat kohenu va'ala she'in makdimin laotad mita ela lamita acheret. So when it comes to those who are seen as conspiring witnesses, they're led to be executed with the same mode of execution with which they conspired to be executed, except for conspiring witnesses who testified that the daughter of a priest had an affair, committed adultery, and where the daughter of the priest would be executed by Sreifa, she would be burned, and her paramour would be executed by strangulation, which is chenek. If there were two different punishments, in that case, they're not exactly the two conspiring witnesses taken to directly be executed with the exact same mode of execution that they sought to have inflicted on the woman, which is what? Burning. They wouldn't be burned. Rather, they're executed with a different mode of execution, and that is by strangulation. And since I don't apply both those penalties, which is burning and strangulation, and I was in a discussion in Sanhedrin about how I could mix up the penalties and how I could actually effectuate their hazama, I'm now continuing the discussion, and since I'm in a debate about a status change for a Kohen. It's only logical that I should have corporal punishment and not burning or stoning, because I'm not talking about a case where I have capital punishment. I'm only talking about a case that's really about the status of a person, and a person needs to be feeling it in his bones and on his skin, because if I change the status of a Kohen and I can't really change your status, I got to have you feel something. And the way I make you feel something, I'm now adding this part because that's not in the Gemara, but I do something to your body. At least that's my first thought here, because I'm now dealing with corporal punishment. So in other words, it's logical for the Baal Gemara to actually extend the discussion that was happening in Sanhedrin into Makkot, with kind of the ways that we use exceptional cases. And he's saying it's only logical. By the way, this gets into a very interesting point. And with this, I'm going to close up my part for today, because this is what I got for you today. This amount of Gemara and that Mishnah and the Hakdama and the introduction. Many people, and we learned together several years ago in the Beit Midrash, the last perek of Sanhedrin is called Hachelek. And most people do agree and accept that, in fact, Chelek is the last chapter of the Gemara, except that there were certain manuscripts and certain Gemaras that don't have the discussion of the next world and the Messiah and all that beautiful midrash that's at the end of Sanhedrin. They don't have that as the last chapter. They have it as the second to last chapter. And the last chapter of Sanhedrin is all about the beginnings of our issue, and that when it makes a move to corporal punishment, Makkot, it moves into a separate tractate, and the 3 chapters we're about to embark on really begin anew as a tractate unto itself, as a Masechta unto itself, as Makkot. That is Mem Kaf Vav Tav. Even though it says Lokei, Lamed Vav Kuf Hey, the idea came from Torah that there are lashes and that there are corporal punishments. And here is where we get the clarity, at least in a certain case, about how many there were and why. We don't have a general limud to bring us into that. I'll mention that again, because sometimes looking at particular cases and how they unfold help us build a foundational understanding of some of the mindset they had about when they were indeed instituting this kind of punishment. That's what I got for you tonight. Comments, questions to close the evening?
I just think it's very hard to make equivalences here to corporal punishment, in terms of psychological or economic, converting that easily into a number of lashes. Obviously, you can have a whole series of conventions about that, but it's not clear to me yet what is the foundation for the equivalence.
Well, there's definitely no foundation introduced here. Even over thousands of years, yeah, you're right. We don't have the calculators that say, or the computers that say, here's the crime, and how many lashes is it equal to? We definitely remember the big reactions to the canings when we had backpackers, what was it, a couple decades ago in the Far East. And there were Americans that were going to be caned, and these were very big issues. Is there ever any way to assign a certain number of corporal punishments, lashes, caning, certain number of hits to something like stealing, something that would deprive somebody of some economic amount, some status change? I don't know, Barry, but I think we'll hear more about the thinking behind it as we let the Gemara unfold, and we'll ask, like, do they have only symbolic numbers in here? Because if they never did it, does it symbolically change? Are there different numbers of lashes that are administered for different things? Will we be able to learn about that through the numbers that change, or will it always be 40? And what does that say, right? So I'll just leave it as a question at this point.
Thank you.
Ron, did you have your hand? Okay. So that was the beginnings of Masechet Makkot, background and all, and on to great pages of the Talmud we go. I really would welcome, obviously your thoughts and questions. If something comes up throughout the week that wasn't clear and you want me to address it again before we press on weiter, go ahead and move forward. Wonderful group. I hope that we'll really maintain a dedication to learning this year. May our learning be sweet. If I please God, like the prayers of the Beit Midrash should be, I hope to trip no one up by telling you a wrong halacha. I hope to create lots of interesting lines of inquiry, but not lead us down either wormholes or paths that are full of any kind of corruption. And sometimes when we talk about these issues of conspiring witnesses and the evil within human beings and how they can be so much into criminality before the law, before judges and before God, it doesn't speak to our best natures. But I think we're hitting it and addressing it face on so that we can only refine our own determination and our will to really bring goodness and fairness and equity and justice into the world. That's what I want to say about studying this kind of Gemara. Erev Tov.
Erev Tov. Thank you.
Night. Thank you.
Real pleasure. Real pleasure. Great to see everybody.
Good to be back. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to be back.
Thank you.
Nice to
Bye,
see
everyone.
everybody.
Bye.